Okay, we're doing Parsha. This week's Parsha is Behar. Behar is a short Parsha. I think it's 47 psukim. It's a very short Parsha. Even when it goes with Bechukoi, say it's not that long, but Behar by itself is quite short. Behar is an interesting Parsha because it's an important Parsha. Which Parsha in Torah deals with business? You ask the average person, which Parsha in Torah deals with business? I'll tell you Mishpatim. But the truth of the matter is, in many ways, it's more Behar than Mishpatim. All the halachas of kinyonim, acquisitions, sales, and all these kinds of things. I know, it's all in Parshat Behar. The small little Parshat Behar has a lot of the very, very important halachas of business, of Chesed Mishpat. And the Haftarah that we read from Yirmiyah, and this year we're going to read it because Behar and Mechesi are separate, is quoted in the Masechta Baba Kama, in the Yeshivish Masechtas. You should write it on a piece of cheres, and you should bury it in the ground, make a shtar. It's a pasuk from the Haftarah of this week, because Parshat Behar deals with kinyonim. There's a Rashi and other things. There's a Rashi at the end of our Parsha that argues, and I just noticed that I never gave a class on it, so I'll have to find an opportunity. There's a Rashi at the end of our Parsha that shows how the entire Parsha is one hemshech, it's one story, from the beginning to the end. And what's the story? It's the story of faith. You got to believe. You're living in Eretz Yisrael, and you're told once in 7 years there's no work, there's no parnasa. Once in 7 years, as they say in Koilel, trust your father. I mean, trust God. Yeah, once in 7 years you got to trust God. And when you have a Yovel, it's twice in succession. And the halachas of Shemitah, as you all know, apply only in Eretz Yisrael. Bizman hazeh it's only midrabanan, but they only apply in Eretz Yisrael. And of course, the idea Yisrael is a holy land. We're closer to Hashem, so there's an expectation of higher faith. In other words, there's a possibility for higher faith, and therefore there's an expectation for higher faith. For the Kabbalists keeping score at home, Chutz La'aretz is considered Kabbalistically Asiyah. Eretz Yisrael is considered Kabbalistically Yitzira, Yerushalayim is considered Kabbalistically B'riyah, and the Beis Hamikdash is considered Kabbalistically Atzilus. What does that mean? That means in Chutz La'aretz you see Teva, you don't see Hashem at all. Like the Gemara's Lashon, living in Chutz La'aretz is like worshipping idols in purity, because you're living in a place where you don't see Hashem's presence. Eilam HaYitzira is a place where you see Hashgacha Pratis, you see Hashem's hand in nature. Elam Abriya, which corresponds to Yerushalayim, is a place where you see miracles. And Elam Atzil is the place where you see the Eibshter. So Eretz Yisrael is a higher standard, but the of Elam HaYitzira, and on some level even Bizman hazeh, even times of Galus. So there's an expectation of more Amunah. What happens when you don't have more Amunah? You start to sell things. If you don't trust Hashem, all of a sudden your finances go down. In other words, the opposite. Not that you're going to guard your wealth and you're going to be careful to worry about money. Are you going to be successful? If you're going to trust Hashem, you're going to be more successful. And if you don't trust Hashem and you don't keep Shemitah, you have to sell things. First, you're going to sell your metaltalim, your assets that are not ba'achrayis. And when you can run out of them, you're going to start selling your land. And you're going to end up selling yourself. First, you're going to sell yourself to a Jew, then you're going to sell to a non-Jew. The end of the Parsha is le'ekim mishpachas ger. You're going to end up selling yourself to Eved Ivri itself. So there's a Rashi in Shabbos as Chitas, and pay attention to that Rashi. It's not so long, but Rashi goes through the whole Parsha and he shows you that it's like a cascade, like it's an avalanche. It's a series of dominoes. If you don't have a moon on the higher level, you fall to the next level. If you don't have a moon again, you fall to the next level. In other words, Hashem gave us a series of mitzvahs that are expensive, they're hard. Because these mitzvahs involve trusting Him. These mitzvahs involve not just thinking about Gashmias from a strictly material perspective, but truly believing that you quote only, end quote, make a keli and panasa, and the panasa comes from Him, and the more you believe it, the more you see Him, the less you believe it, the more you suffer. So the Parshat Behar has a constant, a scheme from the beginning to the end. It talks about many different things, but the Rashi says it's one of the last Rashis in the entire Parsha, that the whole Parsha from the first pasuk to the last pasuk is one continuum. One of the ideas which is mentioned in this week's Parsha twice is the idea that the Jewish people are Hashem's slaves. You have it in Pasuk Membeis. In Pasuk Membeis it says, Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim, avadehem asher etzesi esam eretz Mitzrayim, ani Hashem Elokeichem. No, I made a mistake. In Pasuk Membeis it says, Ki avadehem asher etzesi esam eretz Mitzrayim, they're my servants who I took out of the land of Egypt. Lo yimachorim keres avad, they cannot be sold as a slave. And in Pasuk Nunhei it says, Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim, the Jewish people are my slaves. Avadehem, they're my slaves. Asher etzesi eretz Mitzrayim of Egypt, they shall Elokeichem, I'm God, your God. Two psukim in our Parsha, both Hashem announces that the Jewish people belong to me. And in both cases, Rashi says, Shtare koidem. I own them before you do. When a Jew is sold, even if he's sold to a goy, if the goy is a goy, as the expression is, Yad Yisrael Takif, if the goy follows Torah, the goy is told, I want you to know, you purchased a Jew, you purchased somebody against whom there is a lien, right? If you buy a house, I bought a house many years ago with the help of grace of God. So one of the things that you buy when you buy your house is called title insurance. Title insurance means what happens if you buy this house and you take a loan from the bank for who knows how much money and you give it to the seller, and then a week later or a month later, a year later, some guy comes along and claims the house belonged to him. And the seller was a gane, or the seller didn't know that he was a prior owner, or there's liens and taxes against it in Talazachin. So you buy a special insurance, it's called title insurance, and one of the things that happens before you're able to complete a sale is that the bank makes sure that there's no liens against this house, nobody else owns it, because if you're going to buy a house that somebody else already owns, the bank is going to be in trouble, and you're going to be in trouble, and the bank's money is going to be in trouble. As they say in the real world, blah, 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 blah. Anybody who buys a Jew as a slave, the Torah says, I want you to know you are purchasing a commodity against whom there is a lien. Somebody bought them already. You're buying something. I want you to know, Kili b'nei Yisrael, they belong to me. So you want to use them, I'll let you use them for a time, whatever the particulars are, but you should know, Kili b'nei Yisrael avadim. So you buy a slave, a Jewish slave, even if a goy doesn't have a chiyuv to follow dinei Torah, but the Eibishter says to the goy, I want you to know, you purchased a Jew, you purchased somebody that's already owned. And therefore, your ownership and your legal possession of that item is limited to the allowances of the prior owner, which is the Eibishter. And of course, the way he said the Lashon in Rashi is, he says it twice. Shtare koidem, my shtar, my document of ownership came before yours. So, as they say, I'm going to let you buy him, I'm going to let you pay for him, I'm going to let you use him for a time, I just want you to know I own him. My shtar came first, and my shtar is not annulled by your shtar. What is the reason this pasuk is brought technically? Because the Torah is talking about a slave going out by Yovel, right? When the Jubilee year comes, the slave is free. And when the Jubilee year comes, the slave is free no matter what, right? A regular Eved Ivri serves 6 years. What happens if Eved Ivri serves a year, the next year is Shemitah? He doesn't go out by Shemitah, he has to serve 6 years, the 7th year he goes out. But what happens the next year is Yovel, the Jubilee year? He could have been purchased yesterday. When the Yovel comes, the slave is free. So you have it twice in the Chumash. Once, when a Yid buys a slave, a Yiddish slave. And the second time when a Goy buys a Yiddish slave. A Goy, a non-Jew, purchases a Jewish slave. Now, a non-Jew purchases a Jewish slave. We're talking about a non-Jew that's going to listen to the Sanhedrin. Either he's listening to the Sanhedrin because he believes in Torah, or he's listening to the Sanhedrin because the Jews are very powerful. But if he's not going to listen to the Yidden, then the Yidden have no control. But the Psak Din HaTorah is, a non-Jew buys a Jewish slave, he buys him under the presumption that this person has an earlier document of ownership. This human being is owned by somebody before, and therefore when Yovel comes, he's going to has to go out free. So they have twice the same idea basically. The Yidden are called Hashem's slaves, and Shtare Koidem, Rashi says he belongs to you before he belongs to you, and therefore when the Yovel comes, the sale is off, both when a Jew bought him as well as when a non-Jew bought him. Now, the Sforno says a little bit of a different spin, right? According to what I just said, This statement of the fact, Avadahem, the Jew belongs to me, is being told to the guy, is being told to the buyer. A buyer buys a commodity, and then you whisper, I want you to know, you're buying a commodity, but you should know there's a lien against it. Somebody owns it before you. Now, if you want to pull out of the sale, it's your business. But you should understand, you're buying a commodity as an earlier owner. That earlier owner is going to come along one day and reclaim his possession. And that's going to be when Yovel comes, or when 6 years come, whatever the particulars are. The Sforno has a different spin. The Sforno spin is the exact opposite. A human being who's Hashem's slave, who went ahead and took for himself another master, should be a slave forever. You should throw away the key. What kind of business do you go and sell yourself to somebody else? So the Sforno says that the Jew deserves to be enslaved. The Jew deserves to be put through the worst conditions because of the bad choices that he made. But in the end, he's God's. In the end, he's Hashem's slave. And because Hashem owns him, Hashem says, as much as I'm upset and as much as I'm disappointed with him, because he's mine, I'm not going to let him be sold into slavery for posterity. This is what the Sforno's spin is. In other words, that the Avadahem is not being told to the buyer, Avadahem is being told to the slave. You deserve to be sold as a slave. But the Eibishter owns you, and he wants you, and he likes you. And therefore, in spite of yourself, the Eibishter says, he's not going to be a slave forever. Now, Rabbi Yossi, I spent an hour preparing this class. I have a whole bunch of different ideas, just loose ideas, disparate ideas, from Midrashim, from Chazal. It's mostly built on the Torah Shlema, but I have some notes about this idea that the Yidden are the Eibishter's slaves. Okay? And I'm going to go through, in other words, today's class is interpreting the meaning of the Eibishter saying Jews belong to me, that the Jews are my slaves. There's a whole bunch of different insights from the Chazal. Some of them are more positive. Some of them are more negative. Okay? But we're going to go through them in whatever order we have, whatever time. I don't have as much time as I would have liked either. Number one, there's Halach and Gemara. It's Shulchan Aruch, which is, you could almost say that it's not a fair halacha. If I hire you to do a job for me, and the job takes a week, you're allowed to quit at any time. If I hire you to do a job, and I pay, for sure by a schir yom, and the job takes a week, you can quit at any time. You know why? Because you belong to God. You have a prior owner. At any time, a Jewish laborer can say, I'm not going to work anymore. Now, if a Jewish laborer stops working in the middle, he's responsible for the job to get finished. So you could take his salary and hire somebody else or whatever arrangements, but you cannot force it to finish the work. If a Jewish laborer quits in the middle, you cannot stop him from quitting. You can penalize him. You can pay for it. But you cannot force a Jew to do work against his will, because it's a din in Torah based on this mashal. The Torah says that a Jew belongs to God. One of the halacha l'maaseh, an actual halacha which comes from this din, is Eved Ivri. You hire a worker, he's Jewish. In the middle of the day, he can quit on the grounds, I don't want to do it. I'm a free man, you can't force me to do it. But you agreed, you gave your terms, maybe even made a contract. The particulars don't matter. Based on this idea that we belong to Hashem. Go ahead.
So let's say you hire someone to work for a week and he works 6 days and almost finished and quits. Can you say, like, I'm not paying you anything?
No, you have to pay him for the work he did. That's the word. You pay him for the work he did, then you have to hire someone to do the rest of the work. Sure. If that other laborer is going to cost more money, you can take it off his 6 days. But you can't just not pay him. In other words, it's basically a non-fairness built into Torah based on religious grounds. In business, if I agree to do a job and I quit in the middle, there's all kinds of consequences. Torah says, fair or not fair, since a Jew belongs to me, he can quit at any time. He has the financial loss he has to cover, but you can't force him to do work against his wishes. You understand? It's where in Lashon HaYeshiva, where Isser meets Mammon. In the world, in the laws of Mammon, I can't do this, but in the laws of Isser, as the property of Hashem, I could. You understand? That's how this works. There's a Midrash which says something very sweet. We spent like 6 weeks learning Mishpatim this year, if you remember, yeah? The Midrash asks the question, how come the very first mitzvah after Matan Torah is Eved Ivri? How come the very first mitzvah after Matan Torah is Eved Ivri? We just came out of Mitzrayim. We just got outside of the Dibris. The first thing Hashem teaches us is Yisichna Eved Ivri. Of course, the Alter Rebbe has his Pshat in Torah, which I talked about in the Shir. But the Medrash of the Parsha Tezach, Jews were slaves in Egypt. So when they were born as a nation, the very, very first thing they announced was what? A Jew can never be a slave. It's almost historic. Every nation, right, when the United States of America was built, they wrote what's called the Declaration of Independence, right? And the Declaration of Independence, if you ever read it, starts off any time in the annals of history where one nation feels like it has to separate from another nation. In that case, America of England, they have an obligation to provide a Declaration of Independence explaining why they're breaking away, and then there's an explanation. Every nation is built on certain core principles. Right? America was built on the principle of democracy because we felt we didn't have enough freedom. Every nation with the principles. What was the principle which the Jewish people were built? Slavery. We came from slavery, and the very first thing we announced when we became a nation is a Jew will never be a slave. And that's the pshat in this posuk, avodah, when the Eibush took us out of it, they made us his slaves. And therefore we can never truly be a slave to anybody else. And of course, this plays itself out in the dinim of Eved Ivri, that even when you purchase a Jewish slave, it can only be for 6 years or until Yovel, and other things like that. There's a cute little medrash. I'm sure there's a lot of depth to this medrash. I just found this medrash very, very interesting. When Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu that the Yidden give a machzah shekel of keifer nafshe, Moshe, that doesn't make any sense. And Hashem says to Moshe, why doesn't it make any sense? He says like this: if they're children, if they're bonim, how much you have to give for Pidyon Haben? 5. If they're avodim, how much you have to give for an Eved that gets a malchus? 30. But a machzah shekel, what is it? Moshe doesn't understand. Hashem tells them the keifer nafshe is a machzah shekel, and Moshe says if they're bonim, if they're your children, they have to pay 5 shekel. If they're avodim, they pay 30 shekel. What's the half a shekel? And the Ibn says that's how it is, a half a shekel. Rabbi said I guess the underlying constant in the different midrashim, the speak about Bonim and Avodim is as follows. The Eibush created us as a nation. And we have a choice. And the choice is whether we're going to be Bonim Atam Hashem Elokeichem or we're going to be Avodim. In the davening of Rosh Hashanah, we say, in Hayom Haras Olam, Im Kevonim, Im Kavodim. We're either Hashem's children or Hashem's slaves. Or to say it backwards, when we say the prayer Avinu Malkeinu, and Avinu Malkeinu goes back to the Tanoim, our Father, our King. Our Father, our King is the same thing as saying we're His sons and we're His slaves. We have 2 possible relationships with Hashem. We can have a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu as His sons, and we can have a relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu as His slaves. And I guess on some level it's our choice. What's the difference in a ben and an eved? You ever learned in the slichas? In the David Rosh Hashanah we say this: Im kevonim, if we're Hashem's children, Rachameinu keracham avabanim, have mercy on us like a father has mercy on his children. Vim ka'avadim, and if we're your slaves, eineinu lechatloyes, we look to you with pleading eyes. At the tchanein have rachmanas on us, v'teitzi ka'aretz et keseinu, you show our righteousness, because an owner of a slave doesn't love his slave. He doesn't have rachmanas on his slave. But a slave belongs to him, he's a commodity. And if the master ruins a slave, the master is ruining his own wealth. So im kavonim, if we're Hashem's children, then our relationship with Eibush is based on love. If kavodim, it's not based on love, but the fact that we belong to Hashem also ultimately serves our advantage, because the Eibush doesn't want to waste his resources. In the slichas, we have a prayer at the end of slichas that we say before Rosh Hashanah, which is written in Aramaic. And the prayer goes about a son and a father, a son and a slave, right? Bra, a son who sins, his father puts him in jail. Avoy the chayis, the father who has rachmanis, unties his chains. And then he says a slave, the same thing again. A slave, his father puts him in jail, his master puts him in jail, so sof kol sof, he releases him as well. In other words, us being Hashem's slaves has 2 aspects to it. Number 1, the fact that we're his slaves and not his sons shows a nechasaron, something wrong with us. The Midrashim say, If we behave as we're supposed to, we're called his children. If we don't behave as we're supposed to, we're called his slaves. But when the Eibishter says, Avad Aheim, when Hashem announces in his Chumash, you're my slaves, Hashem is saying something very interesting. You can mess it up. You can foul it up. But you're mine. You belong to me. And because you're mine, no matter how much you mess it up, I don't want you to be destroyed because it doesn't serve my purpose. And that's ultimately the Maile, the Yisra, the idea that we call the Vadahim. It says in one of the Midrashim that in the second pasuk it says, Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim. The Jewish people are my slaves with the word li. The Chazal say a rule, Kol makam sheneim li in azaz li'elam. The word li denotes, the meaning of the word li is forever. Like vikhu li truma. Anytime the word li, it means forever. Ki li b'nei Yisrael avadim, we are the slaves of HaKadosh Baruch forever, which means, in our worst moment, when the Eibishter is, quote, the angriest with us, and in terms of a father-son relationship, we burned that bridge, and there whatever consequences we are supposedly supposed to get, we remain his. And because of the fact that we remain his, the Eibishter does not let us to be destroyed because we're his wealth, because we're his property, because we belong to him. There's another Midrash which I found fascinating, and wegen dem Midrash came in Klaren. This Midrash, I think, is a foundation for a big Chassidus, for a big drasha, where the Midrash says as follows: the Eibishter loves Gedim. Hashem loves converts. What is the proof that Hashem loves converts? Because converts are called slaves. Converts are called avodim, and Yidden are called avodim. So the Midrash is saying, you know why Jewish people are called avodim? Yidden are called avodim because they're like Gedim, like converts. That's what the Midrash says. Hashem loves converts. Hashem loves Gedim, Gedei Tzedek. What is the proof that Hashem loves Gedim? Because he calls all of us his slaves. And a Ged is called an Eved. So by identifying Jewish people by a title which is attributed to Gedim, it shows that the Eibishter favors Gedim. Now what's a Ged? Let's be straight. What's a Ged Tzedek? What's a righteous convert? In the simplest statements, a Ged is Avraham Avinu. It's a Ged is. What makes you Jewish? Your father and your mother. What I do about it? Nothing. Right? There are certain days I wake up in the morning and I say, maybe I should have had a different father, different mother, yeah? What's a Ged? A Ged chooses it. There's a very, very famous letter, I spoke about it many times, the Rebbe did, to Rabbi Ovadia Hager, I think Rabbi Ovadia Hager. He was a contemporary of the Rambam's, and he asked the Rambam Shas Nalocha. When we daven, we say, the first bracha, Elkei Avraham, Akeinu v'Elkei Avo Yiseinu. My God and the God of my father. Can a Ger Tzedek say Elkei Yiseinu? And there's a lot of circumstances in Tefillah and other places where we refer to Hashem as the God of our fathers. What should a Ger Tzedek do? And the source of it is Bikurim. When you owned a piece of land in Eretz Yisrael and you would bring the fruit, in Bikurim you say, Asher Asat Alav Yiseinu, you gave our ancestors. So a Ger for sure, a Ger can't really own that so, but if he does, it's maybe V'nikoire. But there's a lot of shilas about Misha Berech Saviseinu, Avraham, Yitzchak Yankov Yevorech is Chaim Avraham ben Avraham. If you're a Ger Tzedek, Misha Berech Saviseinu, that's my father. So the Rambam wrote him a long letter with many details, and the Rambam's letter is very famous. It's also incredibly warm. First, the Rambam writes that every Ged is Ben Avraham, which is the source of the halacha, that when a Ger Tzedek gets an aliyah, they announce his name as whatever his name is, Gedalia Ben Avraham, or Avraham Avinu, or Sarah Imenu. But then the Rambam writes that every Ged is a son of God, and he brings rayas. That a Ged is not a son of Avraham, he's son of the Eibishter himself. In other words, a Ged is not the child of Avraham Avinu, he is Avraham Avinu. So a Ger Tzedek has a huge advantage. Why? He chose it. Now a Ger Tzedek has a huge disadvantage, which is an undeniable truth. And I know that this is very politically incorrect, but it's the truth. A Ger Tzedek's chesed is that he has no yichus. Gej. Now yichus is like zeros, as you've heard the expression 1,000 times. If you put a 1 in front of it, it makes a large number. Without a 1, it's nothing. But in the Gemara, there's an actual story. A Maisa b'Poyel Mamish. There was a Yid whose name was Akiva ben Yosef. You may have heard of him, right? What was his first name? Reb Akiva. Reb Akiva, the Gemara says, he was one of the greatest Jews who ever lived. I say this to people all the time. If you made a list with the 5 most important Jews in history, the first person on the list is Moshe. The last person on the list is Mashiach. Who are the 3 in the middle? My 3 are Ezra, Sefer, Rabbi Akiva, and the Rambam. Those are my 3. No, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi wrote down the Torah that he got from Rabbi Meir, learned from Rabbi Akiva. The whole Torah we have is Rabbi Akiva's. Rabbi Akiva is one of the most important Jews in history, and he was his father was a convert, not his great-great-great-great-grandfather. His father was a Ger Tzedek. So the famous story in Masechta Brachos that Rabbi Gamliel was demoted. He was the Nasi. He was real gesh. Yeah, he was real gesh. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi's grandfather. He was real gesh. He came from the Yehuda Hanasim, Hillel Hanasi, David HaMelech, the whole thing, and he was Mevayish Rabbi Yeshua. He humiliated Rabbi Yeshua. He did it more than once. Rabbi Yeshua is such a beautiful Jew. When you learn about Rabbi Yeshua in the Mishnayos, you just love him. But they weren't so nice to him. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi picked on him. Rabbi Gamliel picked on him. So they got together and they decided they're firing Rabbi Gamliel. And their first choice for replacement was Rabbi Akiva. Because he was the greatest person. Why did they not choose Rabbi Akiva? They were afraid of Kpeda. They were afraid that Rabbi Akiva becomes the Nasi. Rabbi Gamliel's upsetness will hurt him. Because he has no yichus. In other words, Rabbi Akiva's standing was unquestionable. But when you get into a situation where another great tzaddik is upset with you and you need protection, for this you need chusavis. And Rabbi Akiva didn't have it, so they chose Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, who was a Sidi Lezer. He was a Kohen and an Osher, Alamailis. He had a lot of gej. So they weren't worried about that Indian. But the Geir is missing that mile of yichus. But in terms of yichus atzmei, there's nobody greater than a Geir. So the Midrash says, why are Yidden called Avodim? Because they're like Gerim. Why are Jewish people called Hashem's slaves? In addition to calling Hashem's children, because if we're Hashem's children, we're Jewish because we were born into it. If we're Hashem's slaves, that means that our Jewishness begins with Gerus. There's something personal about it. So this is one of the many Midrashim Chazal that enlighten the significance of the Jewish people being called Avodim. That we're like every single Jew in every single generation is considered like the first generation. You know, the Rebbe had Bali Tshuva. And I grew up in Crown Heights, and when Bali Tshuva were coming here, people had different reactions about Tshuva. Some people embraced them, some people couldn't stand them. But they were the Rebbe's children. The Bali Tshuva were the Rebbe's kids. And a lot of them felt self-conscious, a lot of them felt second class. Now it's very different, but then they really felt that way. And there are stories of people telling the Rebbe, my grandfather did not learn in Neville. So there's written answers from the Rebbe and there's oral answers from the Rebbe. Orally, the Rebbe once told somebody, I have 2 kind of Hasidim. The Hasidim that I inherited from my father-in-law, and the Hasidim that I myself created. My own. And the Hasidim that I myself created, this is the Balei Tshuva. And B'Ksav, the Rebbe wrote to somebody that the Alter Rebbe's Hasidim were all not Hasidim, descendants of Hasidim. They all came from Esnagdim. V'yadua ma'alosam. We know how special they were. So here's a medrash that interprets the idea that the Jewish people call Avdi Hashem, that it makes our relationship with Hashem personal and individual. We are like Gedim. The medrash says we start out as slaves. Then we become children. And then we become brothers. You become Abish's brother. And I wrote in the notes as I was preparing reading this medrash, there's a pasuk in Shir Hashirim where the Jewish people not just called Hashem's brother, there's a pasuk in Shir Hashirim actually called Hashem's mother, which is a very weird kind of a concept. But this is the medrash says that we're first his slaves, then his children, and then his brothers. So the medrash is like this, that we could have been Hashem's children. If we're not Hashem's children, we could be Hashem's slaves. And then there's the pasuk that says, you could have been at least Hashem's slave, and you didn't serve Hashem with joy, so you're going to serve your enemy, and you're going to become the Eved of Nebuchadnezzar, the slave of Nebuchadnezzar. In other words, there's a Ben, and there's an Eved, and then there's an Eved who's lost. But even a Jew who's fallen so low that not only you don't call him Hashem's child, you can't really call him Hashem's slave, because he's the Eved of Nebuchadnezzar, the Eibishter still says Avadahim. Even that, a similar Jew, is ultimately, he's mine. And because he's mine, the Eibishter's interest in us, like it says in Tanya, at the end of chapter 28, Hashem does things to the Jewish people sometimes for His own sake. Okay, Ma'ariv, they're waiting for me downstairs.